It was a chilly evening in Los Angeles, with the kind of biting cold that seeped into your bones. The streets buzzed with the usual chaos, cars honking, people rushing, and the occasional street performer trying to grab a moment of attention. Among the crowd, a homeless man named Jacob sat on the corner of a busy intersection, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that barely shielded him from the cold. Life hadn't been kind to Jacob. Once a hard-working construction worker, an injury on the job and a series of unfortunate events had left him without a home, a job, or a sense of purpose. He had been sitting there for hours, a small cardboard sign resting in front of him. It read, "Anything helps." God bless most passers-by avoided his gaze, hurrying along as if he didn't exist. Jacob was used to the indifference by now, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the few crumpled dollar bills in his jar wouldn't be enough for a proper meal. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the bustling city, a man walked past Jacob. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, sunglasses shielding his eyes, and a casual jacket that made him blend in with the crowd. There was nothing particularly striking about him, just another pedestrian lost in the sea of people. But something about the man caught Jacob's attention. Summoning what little courage he had left, Jacob called out, "Excuse me, sir. Can you spare $1?" His voice was hoarse, worn from countless rejections in the cold air. The man paused mid-step and turned to face Jacob. For a moment the two locked eyes, and Jacob felt a strange sense of familiarity in the stranger's face. But he couldn't quite place it. The man stepped closer, lowering his sunglasses slightly to get a better look at Jacob. "What do you need it for?" the man asked, his tone calm but direct. Jacob hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I just need something to eat. It's been a rough day," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The man studied Jacob for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Jacob's astonishment, he crouched down so they were at eye level. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jacob," he replied, confused by the man's sudden interest. "Well, Jacob," the man said, extending a hand, "it's nice to meet you. I'm Clint." The name sent a jolt through Jacob. He stared at the man in disbelief, suddenly realizing why his face looked so familiar. This wasn't just any stranger. It was Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and filmmaker. Jacob's mouth fell open, but no words came out. Clint smiled faintly, as if amused by Jacob's reaction. "Don't worry," he said. "I get that a lot. Let's talk for a minute." Jacob nodded, still in shock. What started as a desperate plea for $1 had turned into a chance encounter with one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. Little did Jacob know, this meeting would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Jacob sat there, stunned, as Clint Eastwood remained crouched in front of him, making the bustling city around them feel like it had gone silent. Jacob wasn't sure what to say or how to act. His request for a single dollar had turned into something surreal, a genuine interaction with one of the most famous faces in the world. Clint's calm demeanor, however, quickly put him at ease. "You said you needed something to eat," Clint began. "When was the last time you had a good meal, Jacob?" Jacob hesitated before answering. "Yesterday," he lied, his voice uneven. The truth was, it had been 2 days since he had eaten anything substantial. The bag of chips he had managed to buy earlier was long gone, and his stomach felt like it was tying itself in knots. Clint seemed to sense the truth behind Jacob's words. He stood up, glancing at the nearby street. "Come on," he said, motioning for Jacob to follow him. "What?" Jacob stammered, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I said, come on," Clint repeated with a small smile. "Let's get you something to eat." Jacob's legs felt weak as he scrambled to his feet, clutching his tattered blanket tightly. He followed Clint down the street, struggling to keep up with the man's long strides. They soon arrived at a small diner tucked away from the main road. It was the kind of place that felt warm and inviting, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Clint opened the door and gestured for Jacob to go in first. Inside, a few patrons glanced their way, their eyes widening as they recognized the celebrity. Clint didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he was simply used to the attention. "Sit anywhere," Clint told Jacob, who chose a booth in the corner, away from the curious gazes. A waitress approached, her eyes darting between Jacob and Clint with a mixture of confusion and excitement. "Coffee for me," Clint said before nodding toward Jacob. "And whatever he wants." Jacob stared at the menu, his hands trembling. It had been so long since he'd had the luxury of choosing what to eat. Maybe just a sandwich?" he said hesitantly. Clint raised an eyebrow. "You can do better than that. Order whatever you want." Jacob swallowed hard, finally allowing himself to pick a hearty meal, a burger with fries and a side of soup. Clint added an extra order of pancakes to the list, much to Jacob's surprise. As they waited for the food, Clint leaned back in his seat, studying Jacob with a thoughtful expression. "So, how'd you end up here?" he asked, his tone free of judgment. Jacob hesitated. It wasn't a story he liked telling, but something about Clint's genuine interest made him open up. "I was a construction worker," he began. "Worked hard, saved what I could, but then I got injured on the job. Couldn't work anymore. The bills piled up, and before I knew it, I lost everything. My apartment, my car, everything." Clint listened intently, nodding occasionally. "No family to help out?" Jacob shook his head. "My parents passed a few years ago, and the friends I had, well, they disappeared pretty quickly once things went downhill." The food arrived, momentarily halting their conversation. Jacob dug in, savoring every bite. It wasn't just the taste of the food that warmed him. It was the kindness Clint had shown him, a complete stranger. As they ate, Clint shared some stories of his own struggles, from his early days in Hollywood when he was broke and struggling to make a name for himself. "Life has a way of testing us," Clint said, his voice steady. "But sometimes those tests are what make us stronger." Jacob nodded, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. Clint's words, and his actions, were a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still kindness in the world. When the meal was over, Clint leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've got potential, Jacob. I can see it. Don't let this situation define you." Jacob didn't know how to respond. All he could do was nod, his throat tight with emotion. Little did he know, Clint wasn't done surprising him yet. As Jacob and Clint stepped out of the diner, the world outside seemed brighter, though the sun was now beginning to set. Jacob felt a warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite put into words. For the first time in years, someone had seen him as more than just a homeless man on the street. Clint walked alongside him, his pace unhurried. They reached the corner where Jacob usually sat, his makeshift home of tattered blankets and a few belongings still waiting there. Clint gestured toward it. "Is this where you've been staying?" he asked. Jacob nodded, slightly embarrassed. "It's not much, but it's all I've got." Clint remained silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned to Jacob and said, "Stay here for a second." Before Jacob could ask why, Clint crossed the street and disappeared into a nearby convenience store. Jacob stood there, fidgeting with his blanket, wondering what the man could possibly be doing. Minutes later, Clint emerged carrying several bags. "Here," Clint said, handing Jacob the bags. Inside were essentials, clean clothes, toiletries, bottled water, and some packaged food. Jacob's eyes widened. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," Clint replied simply. "But sometimes, a little help can go a long way." Jacob was overwhelmed. He clutched the bags tightly, trying to hold back tears. No one had ever done something like this for him before. But Clint wasn't finished yet. "Do you have any skills, Jacob?" Clint asked, his tone direct but kind. Jacob hesitated before answering. "I used to be pretty good with my hands, building things, fixing things. I was a foreman before the accident." Clint nodded, seeming to file away the information. "And would you want to get back to that? Working, I mean?" Jacob blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Of course," he said quickly. But I don't have anything. No ID, no place to stay, nothing. Clint placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. One step at a time, he said. Let me make a call. Jacob watched as Clint pulled out his phone and stepped away, speaking to someone in low tones. Jacob couldn't make out the conversation, but Clint's calm demeanor gave him a strange sense of hope. After a few minutes, Clint returned, slipping his phone back into his pocket. All right, Clint said. I've got a friend who runs a construction company. He's always looking for good workers, and he owes me a favor. You start Monday. Jacob stared at him, stunned. You're serious? Dead serious, Clint said with a small smile. But you're going to need a place to stay and a way to get around. Let's take care of that next. Jacob didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that was happening. Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, wasn't just helping him. He was giving him a second chance at life. They walked a few blocks to a nearby shelter, where Clint spoke to the manager, arranging for Jacob to have temporary housing until he could get back on his feet. Clint even covered the first month's rent for a small room in a shared house the shelter operated for men looking to reintegrate into society. By the time they were done, Jacob felt like he was dreaming. He had gone from begging for $1 to having food, clothes, a place to stay, and even a job lined up, all in the span of a single day. Clint walked Jacob back to his corner one last time. You've got a fresh start, Jacob, he said. Don't waste it. Jacob nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I won't, he promised. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Clint said. Just pay it forward someday. Help someone else when they need it. As Clint turned to leave, Jacob called out after him. Why did you do all this for me? Clint paused, looking back over his shoulder. Because everyone deserves a chance, he said. And because I could. Jacob watched as Clint walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the evening light. For the first time in years, Jacob felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The next morning, Jacob stood outside the small house Clint had arranged for him. The shelter staff had helped him move in and even provided a few basic supplies. As he looked around the modest room, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. He had gone from feeling invisible to being seen, from hopeless to hopeful, all thanks to one man's kindness. Monday arrived faster than Jacob anticipated. Nervous but determined, he reported to the construction company Clint had called on his behalf. The foreman, a gruff but kind man named Dan, greeted him with a firm handshake. You're the guy Clint told me about, Dan said, sizing him up. He said you've got experience? Jacob nodded. I was a foreman years ago. I can handle tools, repairs, anything you need. Good, Dan said, handing him a hard hat and gloves. We could use a pair of hands, but let me make one thing clear. You're not getting any special treatment. You'll earn your keep here, just like everyone else. Jacob smiled, feeling the weight of Dan's words. That's all I've ever wanted. A chance to prove myself. The work was grueling, but familiar. Jacob quickly fell back into the rhythm of labor, his hands remembering what his heart had almost forgotten, the satisfaction of building something with purpose. Day after day, he showed up early, worked hard, and proved his worth. It wasn't long before Dan took notice. Not bad, Jacob, Dan said one afternoon as they packed up for the day. You've got a good head on your shoulders. Keep it up, and there might be more opportunities for you here. Weeks turned into months, and Jacob's life began to transform. With steady income, he was able to save money, buy better clothes, and even start looking into further education to refine his skills. But what stuck with him most was the kindness Clint Eastwood had shown him. One day, Jacob decided he needed to thank Clint properly. He found the courage to call the number Clint had given him that day outside the diner. To his surprise, Clint answered. Jacob, how's the new job? Clint asked, his voice warm and genuine. It's going great, Jacob replied, his voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to thank you for everything. You didn't have to help me, but you did. You changed my life. Clint's response was simple, but profound. "Jacob, I didn't change your life. You did. I just gave you a push in the right direction." Jacob smiled, his heart full. "Still, I'll never forget what you did for me." "Then don't," Clint said. "And remember what I told you. Pay it forward." Months later, Jacob had an opportunity to do just that. While walking to work, he passed a young man sitting on the curb, looking lost and defeated. Something about the man reminded Jacob of himself. Without hesitation, he stopped and offered the man a sandwich and a few kind words. The man's eyes lit up, and Jacob felt a warmth he hadn't felt before, a realization that he was now in a position to give back. Years down the road, Jacob had not only built a stable life for himself, but had become a mentor to others struggling to find their footing. And though he never saw Clint Eastwood again, he carried the actor's words with him every day. Everyone deserves a chance. Jacob's journey from despair to hope became a testament to the power of kindness and second chances. It all started with a simple request for $1 and a man who saw beyond the surface. Jacob's life, once shadowed by darkness, was now filled with purpose, light, and the belief that even the smallest acts of compassion could ripple outward to change the world.